Hello, I'm Alexis Kennedy. I'm quite. Oh, I'm out of frame already. There we go. I'm Alexis Kennedy. I swear to God, I didn't do anything to my hair to make it do this. It just fucking does it. And I'm really tired, so I may be incomprehensible today because we just launched the Dancer DLC. Hooray! Which seems to met with a good reception, and unfortunately, I fucked up the Steam configurations for Mac and Linux distribution. So people who bought from Mac and Linux on Steam didn't buy it. So I had to spend all of Tuesday night fixing that, and I haven't. And then since then, fixing bugs and generally being nervous. So I'm quite dozy, and I apologise if I start like freestyling or sleeping at any point during this stream. But I'll do my best. This is a mug of coffee, which Lottie, who is here, out of shot, Jesus, has kindly made me. Hello, welcome. If you don't know who I am, or what Cultist Simulator is, or Sunless Sea, or For London, or any of the others, then I don't even know what you're doing here. But this is an intermittent design stream where I talk about whatever has been on my mind recently in design terms, and some things even that might be useful to other people. Right, so in as much as today has a theme, besides me complaining about not being awake enough, it is difficulty and challenge and risk. And a particular conversation with players, with the community at the moment, precipitated this. And that is cursors. So I'll come back to this and talk details. But I made a bunch of balance changes over the past 3 months on the beta branch, gradually. I do development of the beta branch normally. I push changes there very frequently. And then every so often, I push the changes over to live much more carefully. I made a bunch of changes to the beta branch that changed the economy in some quite dramatic and some quite subtle ways of the game. And those bedded in. A lot of veteran players got used to them. And then all of the changes went live on Tuesday at the same time as the Dancer DLC went live. We pushed a big free update. Lots of new stuff. And this is often the way. Something I hadn't thought about that much turned out to excite some strong feelings. And that was this. When you send, in Cultist Simulator, you need to send your followers off on expeditions to get resources. The resources you get are really fundamental to the game. It's possible, but extremely difficult to get any kind of significant victory without a lot of expedition work. The original design of expeditions, you could run an expedition risk-free. You had to max up all your followers, and once you did that, you could basically sail through all the expeditions unless you fucked up. I never liked that because it becomes just a game of patience. And one of the issues with Cultist is that there are degenerate strategies that encourage you to max up stuff a bit too much to my taste. So I never much liked it, but because followers dying on expeditions was huge, and especially named followers dying on expeditions, people felt very strongly about. I kept that in place until I put follower wounds in, and now followers get wounded before they die. A follower can fail on an expedition several times before they turn up their toes. So when I did that, I reduced the success level of expeditions, the likelihood of success, from certain to nearly certain. So now you can't have a 100% chance of passing an obstacle in an expedition, no matter how many followers you bring to bear on it. You have a maximum 90% chance. So there's always a bit of risk. There'll always be things going wrong. Sometimes followers will come home wounded. Sometimes you have to put extra funds in. Occasionally, if you keep sending a battered follower into the breach, they'll die. But these are all sort of graded risks, right? They're all things that come and go. However, there are 4 kinds of obstacle on expeditions. 3 of them are things you need to pass in order to get through the expedition. The 4th, cursors, trigger after the expedition if you don't solve them on the expedition. And it's your classic Curse of the Mummy type occult revenge of the expedition's original occupants, right? You disturb a curse and it comes home and it murders a follower, or it damages your health, or it tries to drive you insane, one of these sort of things. So we had one design change, very intentional, into cursors. And we had another design change that also pushed cursors. But what cursors do is they eat either followers or stats permanently. It's possible to heal with difficulty from a health eating curse, but you can't heal from a reason or passion eating curse. There are ways to mitigate it. You can change between reason and passion. You can bump up reason. But the other design change I made was that there's now a cap on stats. Very intentional again, and I got good feedback on this, mostly. People got that originally, if you could get like 50 in reason, then reason is no longer an interesting or a scarce resource. If you only ever get 4 or 5 reason, then you really care about the destination of each of those reason cards and where they are. Conversely, when you lose one of those reasons to a curse, you really care about that too. So often this is the case with contentious design decisions. You get one change for one reason running into another change for another reason. And there's a third impetus here from an original design intention, which is this. I wanted cursors to feel nasty. I didn't like, I play a lot of CRPGs, and in a CRPG, you go into a tomb, you set off a trap, you get a curse, and basically it's a status effect that you rest to get rid of or use a spell to get rid of. There's no drama to it. It's as much of a nuisance as a poison dart trap that does you like 1 to 6 points of damage. And I wanted cursors to feel like things that you messed with caution. If you were going on an expedition that had a curse attached to it, you would think about it and want to be sure you were well prepared for it, or you might suffer the consequences, or you might not. Curses are uncertain things. So actually the numbers involved aren't that bad. If you lose a stat, it hurts you, but you can get through the game with fewer stats. It narrows your options, but narrowing options is fine. It's the kind of thing I wanted to do. But people have strong feelings about this. And just as science is not about your feelings, also your feelings are not about science. So a number of players felt that their pleasant game of occult solitaire had been messed with. And suddenly, the fact that in theory, there's like a 1 in 100,000 chance that 5 curses in a row will trigger, isn't that comforting? Because in every 100,000 runs, somebody will get that, right? And even if they don't, you're nervous all the time. And every 100 runs, you lose 2 points of reason. That's stressful. And you want to find a way to mitigate stuff about it. So I'll talk in a moment about the mitigation that I added to the beta branch, actually just this morning, after some thought. But I want to talk about how some players reacted like that, and some players said, oh, for goodness sake, no, bring it on. We like that cursors now have teeth. We like that expeditions are no longer a matter of shuffling all your cards into the right order and letting it pass through like water through a tap. We like that sometimes a curse will eat Neville, or will mean that I have to sort of get through the end of the game with just 1 bit of health left. And obviously neither type of player is wrong. And the kind of games I make attract players of both these kinds. I tend to sit in the middle myself. Cultist Simulator, just as Sunless Sea, is a game of exploration. And just as with Sunless Sea, it's also a game of survival. I like games about resource management. I like games with risks. I like games where the RNG can suddenly spin up drama. I also like games where you experiment and explore. There's a lot of story. And these things mesh weirdly. This is, when it works well, it works really well. Sunless Sea, when it worked well, you tread out into the darkness and you find something you really care about on the far side of the darkness, and you care about it much more because it's from the far side of the darkness that would have driven you insane or eaten your crew if you had dealt with it wrongly. But also sometimes you try to cross the darkness and you just run out of fucking fuel and you never see another story and you have to restart. You get fed up with the games, you have to restart and see the same bit of content 5 times, and then you write a cross review on Steam. Same with Cultist. On the one hand, I'm saying go out and experiment and try what you can. And on the other hand, I'm saying this game will kill you if you get it wrong. And again, this is thematically very appropriate. It's a game about messing with unknown forces that can destroy you. So I wanted that to happen. I wanted that tension in there. But also, it's a game that people are playing sitting at their PCs after a hard day at work. And sometimes people want a gentler experience. And in particular, oh yeah, so I'm going to say what he describes as a rude thing about. I'm not mean to her. Okay, so I'm going to use some terminology first. I'm going to apply that terminology to Keelan and Lottie because it will sound less rude. Lottie, my co-founder, sitting over there right now, throwing bonbons and brickbats at me. Keelan Porter, ex at Fail Better, now does some freelance QA and design work for us. So the taxonomy I'm talking about is players who like words like difficulty, words like challenge, words like achievement, words like tangible, words like loss, and players who think all that is bullshit. Now these are continuums, right? They're caricatures. At one end of the continuum, and we'll call them winter players, are the people who play, as I said on a Steam comment earlier, every game of XCOM on Iron Man mode. And they don't fucking reload. If they lose their veteran, they lose their veteran. And that's all there is to it. At the other end, you get people who will reload if they lose one of their men's in XCOM or one of their women's because they've just lost basically Neville or Gladiola or Kajiko, whatever the hell. But these are both really valid play styles. And I oscillate between them. As I said earlier, I've played XCOM and Iron Man, but never for more than like 4 missions, because after the 4th mission, I will misclick and I will lose a veteran. And I'll think, oh, fuck, I didn't mean that. And where a more wintry player would have thought, well, that's part of the fun of experience and achievement and tangible loss and victory. And the heart player would just have reloaded anyway and never played an Iron Man. You know, I'm a bit wintry, but also I like the story and I don't like my intended story being spoiled. Now, very few people play Cultist if they're not a little bit wintry at least. And it's a game with no tutorial. It's meant to be punishing. It's meant to be to take up lots of time. It's not a game that makes many compromises. And it's also really fucking indie, right? It's got quite lo-fi production values intentionally. But obviously, there was a really wide continuum in the community between heart players and winter players. So I don't have a settled strategy for dealing with this divide. Cultist was an experiment, just like all Weather Factory projects or experiments. And I knew interesting things were going to come out of it. So trying to find the best way to bridge that divide is one of the things I want to look at from here on in. One of the ways you bridge that divide is by signaling what the game's for, right? Nobody goes to Darkest Dungeon expecting an RNG-free, low-stress experience. Nobody goes to FTL expecting a low-stress experience. I've got a lot of hours in FTL. I love it, but I've rage quit more than once. Nobody goes to Bejeweled, which is also an extraordinarily good piece of game design, expecting any of the challenge or adversity or loss anyway. So sometimes you just signal. But Cultist does go in the middle, and other games I make are likely to go somewhere in the middle. And I think the key insight here, I hope, is that science is not about your feelings, but science also has no control over your feelings. And game design ultimately is about engineering feelings. If I say this thing you're worried about has literally a 1 in a million chance of happening, that's not very reassuring, because that means sometimes it will happen, right? It's not a 0 in a million chance. What I've said when I say a 1 in a million chance is literally this thing will happen sometimes. And one of the things that games give us is the ability to feel like we can affect our context. We can affect what we're doing. And one of the things that Cultist gives you is a constant feedback loop of try this, something happens. oh, I fucked up. Okay, I can bring it back onto the road. This is one of the things winter players like. They like the idea that something's fucked up and they have to hang on the steering wheel to bring it back onto the road. It's one of the things heart players like as well, is the ability to set things up so you don't veer off the road. Or if you do veer off the road, you can bring it back soon. Obviously, everyone likes challenge, or they wouldn't be here. And as I said on the Discord earlier, I think I'm using as any kind of diss. I'm not. The primary heart principle in Cultist is a thunderskin. You do not fuck with a thunderskin. So what I want to do is provide mitigations wherever I can that allow the game to sort of start steering out of your comfort zone and give you some options to bring it back in. Not reliable ways to bring it back in, but not completely random Hail Mary ways. And also give you some choice about which options you use. That was the point behind follower wounds. So now you send a follower off on an expedition. You've got a choice to make about whether to wait until your follower ranks up and send them in later and get them more notoriety in the meantime. Maybe your rival overtakes you, or whether to send them in now with more risk. If a follower's wounded but they're well suited to an expedition, you've got again another choice about whether to double down on the risk and send them in, but they might get another wound, or whether to try to use somebody else and have a different kind of risk of failing the expedition. This is obviously an improvement on the original implementation, which was just, if you send a follower an expedition, they might die. There's no different gradation of risks there. And then you've got a variety of options for managing. No, I'll get back to that. Okay, so similarly for cursors, the way it works now on the beta branch, the way it's probably going to work from here on in, is that if a curse bites, at low chance, you can do something about it. There are already some things you could do about it. For example, if you really wanted to keep a follower and a worm's curse, 8 followers struck, you could quickly send that follower off on another expedition. So by the time it activated, it didn't get them. But that's still fairly limited. What you can do now is you can, if you generate a powerful enough heart influence, or have a powerful enough heart influence in your back pocket, then you can use that to belay the curse. And the thing is, there are a bunch of different ways to get heart influences, and I will be adding more. You can get heart influences to the Mansus now. It was harder to do that before. There were a few of them. There's a system going in now where you can combine influences in the same way that you can combine law in order to level them up. So you can combine 2 lower level heart influences to keep them alive. Influences hang around longer. They degrade gradually to the next lowest level of influence before they disappear altogether. So you can preserve them a bit longer. And you can subvert influences. So if you get a high level winter influence, you can actually subvert it to a heart influence. If you get a high level, is it edge influence that gets subverted to winter? If you get high level edge influence, you can subvert that to winter and so on. And there is another way going into the game to get influences, which is partially implemented, and it's not even on the beta branch yet, which isn't going to be useful in this circumstance, but in the future will be useful. And that is a use for glass finger toxin that I mentioned on Twitter earlier. Okay, so generally, that's mitigation. And generally, I'm interested in at the moment in difficulty continuum. Jesus, I'm tired. Sorry. Heart versus winter players, different attitudes. Sorry. Let me finish my coffee first. But yes, please. This is something I was thinking about. In fact, before the whole curses thing came up, when I was doing some risk design for the advanced victories, I find it useful. I don't know if anybody else will. There's probably a dozen taxonomies like this already when people talk about roguelikes. But I found myself thinking in terms of player-created risks and player-mitigated risks on the one hand, and risks that crop up now versus risks that crop up later. So, for example, you need to feed the time token in cultist funds or you die. That's not something a player can cause us to happen. That goes on in the background whether you like it or not. And it goes on all the time. You have to be aware of it constantly. It's not something you can put off. you can bank up funds, but that's all. So that's very much a player mitigated, not a player created thing. It's something you have to deal with now. Conversely, dread and fascination, not always, this is obviously a fuzzy sort of way of thinking about things, but dread and fascination often crop up in response to actions by other things in the game. And the way hunger works in traditional roguelikes as a sort of a time limit on levels is, again, a player mitigated rather than a player created thing that crops up later. You don't have to worry about it right now. You always have to be aware of it, though. Conversely, dread and fascination can come out of things the player does. And the canonical classic player created now risk is draw a card. Is a good card or a bad card? Oh, it's a bad card! I shouldn't have drawn from the deck. That was a mistake. I should have drawn from a different deck. And the key thing about the risks then is they're the risks you can do something about. They're a fund timer that just sometimes said, oh, you're dead. That's not really empowering experience. There's nothing you can do to turn the wheel to bring the truck back onto the road. There's only one deck and you only draw from that deck. And sometimes it says you're dead. You know, that's not interesting. Games necessarily are going to give you some decks you have to draw from. Some events happen, right? These are sort of player mitigated rather than player created things. But I think it's helping me at the moment, and I'll come back to this and see how it's worked out, when I'm doing design, to think about whether this is going to be a player created or a player mitigated risk, whether it's going to be something you have to worry about now or something you have to worry about later. And how many of those we have in that part of the game already. Because if all of the risks are player created now, then the game is incredibly tense and also kind of sterile. And if all the risks are player mitigated, deal with later, then it's a very hands-off experience. Anyway, cursors, influence economy. That was the other thing I wanted to talk about. So one of the reasons I chose influences to I'll talk about the design of this actually. One of the ways to talk about chose influences to mitigate cursors is there's been generally a push, as people on the beta branch will have noticed, towards trying to do more with influences. So influences are a generic term for occult stuff that's happening in the world. Like a low-level winter influence is a sort of sense of chill in the room, and a high-level heart influence is like a sort of pounding energy that's probably the personal attention of a major occult entity and can't be ignored. And these are used in rites. You can use them in the same way that in fictional or mythological magic you use the proper position of the stars or the energy created by a death to make something happen. This is time and place correspondence stuff. The nice thing about influences is that a lot of things can create them. A lot of things, it makes sense to use them in principle. I found this when I was doing For London. If you give a jade nugget as a reward, there's a fair number of things that give jade nuggets. There's not many things that use them apart from selling them. If you give a scary story, a tale of terror, as a reward, a lot of things can give you a tale of terror. For London consists largely of events that would make terrifying stories. And a lot of things can use tales of terror. You can write them down and sell them. Maybe somebody asks for them in exchange for information. Maybe you can use them to calm yourself down, to make yourself less manically cheerful, the way dread works. Maybe you, I can't remember what I was saying, sorry. But the point is, if you have resources that can be created in lots of ways, can be used in lots of ways, and if you're building a big system-driven game like this, that's often very useful. So I wanted to find more ways to make influencers usable by more things. And vitality and erudition, the other skill upgrading things, dread, restlessness, fascination, those are all influencers. They can they can be used. Fascination influence? I can't remember now. Anyway, lots of these things can be used in rites, and lots of these things can be combined with each other. So, for example, in the new build, you can use a low-level heart influence with your vitality to upgrade your health stat. And generally, as an ongoing strategic consideration, I'm trying to plug stuff more into the influencers economy. And here is an example of a specific design decision I made with that in mind. My original intention for mitigating curses was you could mitigate curses in one of two ways. Either you could find a sufficiently big heart influence, which is difficult to do. It's possible, but it's difficult. You need to be lucky, or you need to know the way the cards fall in the Mansus and have stored up a spider's door drawer to do this. You need to keep your eye on the curse. You need to keep ranking things up whenever you can. You might do a little bit of slightly cheesy stuff with leaving things in slots. Lots of ways you can do it. You might need to make sure that you dispose of dread if you're planning to go on expeditions, so you get some winter influence. Anyway, so but that's a sort of medium term thing that you can't do straight away. I like the idea of having something that works like buying opium. That if your dread is about to kill you and you really want to do something to deal with it, you just spend some fucking money on opium, get some contentment, and you're okay. There's a button to pull, emergency cable to pull, even if the emergency cable kills you in 10 minutes because you made a Faustian pact. These are always the fun choices. So what I liked was the idea that you could take a heart-aspected follower and you could put them in a curse, and that would sacrifice the follower, but it would always defeat the curse. So you've got probably, if you've got a couple of heart-aspected followers, Clovette and Leo, hanging about, say, and they've got to be followers, not summonings. You've got to put them in the. You've got 2 bullets in the chamber, but one of these bullets is called Leo, one of these bullets is called Clovette. And the decision of, am I going to give up a point of my passion, or am I going to put Clovette in there? Is an interesting one, which make a lot of people very cross, which I'm good with because it's the good kind of cross. The reason I didn't do it in the end was, first of all, I know of old, I get excited by an idea and I do it without thinking through the consequences often. So I've tried to make incremental steps. And secondly, a more interesting way of doing that, potentially, is to plug those followers back into the economy, because that means less specific content work for me later. So if I say I have to write content so that the curses are defeated by heart influence or by heart-aspected followers, I do a lot of specific stuff. If I say, under certain circumstances, any follower can be converted into an influence in some suitably revolting way, then that opens lots and lots of possibilities. And so basically on the docket now, I have a long-term possibility that I will implement something that will allow you to convert Clovette into a nice juicy lump of heart influence, or Leo. A tangent from that, which I think is worth sharing, is one of my favorite bugs this release, which somebody sent in this morning, which is now fixed. It's not fixed on live yet. In Cultist, there's always been a struggle between the things that are unintended consequences that are great and the things that are unintended consequences that are a bug. Canonical early example of this was you could put anything in the inspiration slot for a painting in the first implementation of painting, and it would get used up and disappear. So you could put in dread, you could put in fascination, you could put in restlessness, all this stuff that I'd kind of expected. And those become the subject of the painting in some generally fictional way, and you get a benefit, they disappear. You could also do it with detectives. So you could paint Wakefield into your picture, and Wakefield will trouble you no more. Which on the one hand, fucking yeah. On the other hand, it was a little bit unbalanced, so I had to take it out. And it wasn't at all intentional. So again, obviously I might add a feature at some point, or somebody might mod in a feature at some point, where you can do some sort of horror story thing of painting your enemies or your followers into paintings. That'd be great. But it wasn't intended at that point, so it became a bug. Example of something else that wasn't intended but was good, and which in fact I lent into and did more with, is a recent framework change allowed me to add aspects, they're called in Cultist, to cards already in play. So a follower gets a scar, for example. This is why I didn't add wounds and scars in the first release, because the framework didn't have that to begin with. So followers can start out with 3 winter aspect for their current stage, and they get a winter scar that increases their winter aspect. So the scar is a temporary aspect that gets added, and the the additional winter bonus is also temporary aspects. So not all cards of the same type are the same. That's fine. There's another feature in the framework where cards sometimes turn into other cards. So, for example, people turn into corpses. It's the way of life, and all things end. And so if you're if Neville or Clavet turns into a corpse, and Neville or Clavet has a scar, the corpse also has that scar. Great, that's intentional. Sorry, that wasn't intentional when I built it that way, but as soon as it happened, I realized that was a good thing. I wanted to lean into it, and I made an early design decision about whether or not to lose temporary aspects when a card switched from one thing to another, and I decided to keep them because I thought this kind of stuff would emerge and be interesting. So that's great. Similarly, romantic interest is a temporary aspect and mutation that you can gain. So Saliba gets romantic interest. You're having an affair with Saliba. Saliba gets murdered. He turns into a corpse. The corpse still has romantic interest attached to it. It wasn't intentional, but as soon as I saw it happen, great, we can do stuff with this. It meant I had to fix some bugs where people get jealous of corpses. It meant that I had to write for some specific behavior where if you have a corpse hanging around, it will often occupy the romance event slot because you're grieving for somebody. But again, that feels like an immersion thing. That's great. And with a little bit of work, it then allowed me to add one of the features people have been most alarmed and excited by in the update, which is that if a lover dies, you can actually bring them back to life as a burgeoning or shattered reason and feed them on your blood in a dreadful half-life of your time, a memory of your time together. You can even... It's time for your blood, dear. So that's all great. That's all unintended stuff that I then lean into and expand. And this is the kind of thing where a content-driven framework like Cultist really shines, because people discover this stuff, or sometimes happens by accident. Now here's an interaction that wasn't intended. People turn into corpses. Corpses decay. And when they finish decaying, they turn into notoriety. So the notoriety retains any aspects the corpse has. If the temporary aspect was romantic interest, and you've got a notoriety with romantic interest attached to it, so that will then jump into the ongoing romance slot, which wasn't intended, and gives a weird result. It'll even jump into the slot that pops up when you're doing an ascension at the end of the game, and you'll end up trying to ascend with the notoriety that is caused by the decay or the discovery of the corpse of your ex-lover. Which is something I find hard to parse in any meaningful fictional sense, because that bypasses all the checks I put on slots and recipes to stop like corpses or summonings going into recipes where they weren't intended. So unintended consequences. The good thing about unintended consequences is that they're unintended. The bad thing about unintended consequences is that they're unintended. And a lot of the design work in this project, anything else that's driven by interactions, is about trying to narrow down the ones that you want from the ones that you don't. Any specific questions on that I should address now, or?
Nothing specific to what you've been talking about, but I can throw you some questions.
Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about at the moment is the Romance and the Dancer pack. Some of the changes to design I made on there. Some of this stuff where it's relevant, but this is a natural caesura, so hit me.
All right, I have to remember to repeat the question.
Yes.
Okay. Matthew asks, I've been playing this by starting with the BYT. Am I playing with easy mode?
Matthew asks, I've been playing by starting with BYT. Am I playing on easy mode? Now, I suspect there will be a number of other players in this chat who will have opinions on that. Some of whom will say, actually, it's not as good as a deal as it sounds because of this, or because Oriflamme's is a bit of a noob trap sometimes, or whatever. But I can say that Aspirant was intended to be a little bit of a harsh opening. The expected experience with Aspirant, the default opening, was that you start playing and you're a bit overwhelmed by the number of verbs proliferating on the board. And then you die because you've stopped keeping your eye on funds and you die of hunger. So it's not an accident that if you die of hunger, the next legacy you're always offered is the bright young thing, because the bright young thing doesn't suffer from the immediate problem the aspirant has. The bright young thing has all the money that they need to begin with, even if they don't necessarily later. So it's meant to feel easier than aspirant, and in real and immediate senses it is. Whether a 150-hour veteran would agree with that, I don't know. There are probably some ways through. But generally, I wanted to try to build deliberate contrast between the kind of death you suffer and who comes up next. So, for example, again, if you get arrested, you always get offered the detective next. I haven't had as much time to put as much content into legacies as I originally hoped. So this isn't as rich as... Yes, I'll do my best. Cool. Legacies difficulty. Yeah, so there's meant to be contrasting experience. There's different kinds of difficulty. But what I can finish by saying is it is a bit easier than aspirant, but no shame attaches. Stick with the legacy that works, because it tends to get more similar the deeper into a legacy you get.
One other question that might segue nicely into your DLC.
Yes.
Which is, Mark asks, do you think future DLC and updates will tend to go back and revisit existing mechanics or add new ones?
Mark says, do you think new DLC will tend to revisit existing mechanics or add new ones? Wherever possible, it'll be bringing the changes on existing mechanics rather than adding new ones. For the very simple paired reason that it's less work for me, and also that it's a more stable and interesting and fruitful set of interactions. The detective has always been the least stable of the legacies because he's got a lot of special case code. So on numerous occasions where I changed the way things worked, didn't think to go off and check the detective, and he'd broken in some important way. But and that's just with a small number of legacies. If it expands to 10, I've got a bunch of legacies that work in weird different ways. Then even with some automated testing, QA becomes rapidly no fun at all. But as you probably noticed, I've tended to start adding mechanics to legacies with an intention of using that mechanic in a broader way. So the SCAR legacy, SCAR mechanic in Dancer is an offshoot of the SCAR mechanic for followers, and I will fold back attribute scarring in some way into the game. The Dancer or other extremely goth legacies are likely to be the only ones that are required to use it, but it's likely to become an occasional feature of more mainstream play. Similarly, the detective, used the independent mechanic, the rival troublemaker mechanic, before it was in the rest of the game. I wanted to get rivals in before launch. I didn't have time, and there was more complexity there than I'd realized. So I put the rival in the detective as a stub or a foundation for later work. So that's why when I came back and added rivals more broadly to the game, I revisited detective again and just gave it a little bit of a brush up so that it will now keep on generating rivals for you to hunt down, independents for you to hunt down. That's also why they're called a bit inconsistently rivals and troublemakers and independents, because it didn't make any sense to refer to them as rivals in the detective legacy before they were independent occultists who are your rivals in the main game. So I got stuck with that terminology. So yeah, a little bit of both. The ideal route is to add new things to the game via the legacy and give them some focus in the legacy. But there are so many considerations with adding stuff to this big damn spider web that sometimes it'll be one thing and sometimes another. I want to add a few more legacies to the game that are really, really simple as well. So things like Auctioneer will just probably give you a little bit of spare content and a few slightly different perks to begin with. Dancer was a beefy one, and this segues probably what Lottie was thinking of the segue. Segues neatly into what I was going to talk about, which is Romance Dancer, Advanced and Grand Victories, and Content Bloat. So here's the thing. We probably underpriced the DLC. Yeah, says Lottie. Because conventional wisdom is if you announce the price of a product, a game particularly, a piece of digital work, and nobody says, well, that's a bit pricey, then given, you've got a range of people with different levels of price sensitivity, there's my hand, okay, you probably overpriced it. Here are the super fans, here are the people who don't really care. If the people who don't really care are saying, oh, that's cheap, then probably it's too cheap. So I think because we were a bit twitchy, we underpriced it, but I'm okay with that because a lot of the DLC was about feeling we fulfilled our obligation to keep supporting the game with content. And it means that we can pull back a bit on future bits of DLC. And I'd rather have more smaller, cheaper pieces of DLC that I don't have to stress about putting tens of thousands of words into than I would big pieces of DLC where somebody will complain that I think it's not value for money. But having said that, I made a mistake with both Dancer and I nearly made the mistake with Romance. And that is Cultist Simulator did much better than I expected commercially, which is great. But it meant that there was some sort of difficult second album pressure on putting out the first bit of content. I didn't want to put out a little bit of content and people say, well, that was ordinary. So the Dancer, sorry? Are we? We're on the front page of Steam. Thank you, everyone. So the Dancer is elaborate. It's not even as elaborate as I intended. Dance spoilers now, look away if you haven't played it yet and if you care about this stuff. But the Dancer has this very different system, and it was meant to be very different from the usual Ascensions. The usual Ascensions is kind of classic occultist stuff. You level up, you find rituals, you increase your power, you eventually get to the end of it. Dancer, you're doing something mystical and unpredictable, that's sort of off in the demi-monde of the demi-monde. Sulikana and Igdistis, the patrons of the Igdistis Club, are both almost as unpopular with some of the mainstream occult figures in Cultist as the mainstream occult figures are with the police. So, it's meant to feel particularly Twilight. And it was meant to give veteran players a different experience. So working out how the hell dancers and sendings and lessons and ascensions all interact and what you do at the end was meant to feel a pleasant shock. Having to deal with turning your stats into scars was also, which is one of the pressures for capping the stat cards, was also meant to feel different. And I meant to make it even more complicated. There were going to be a variety of different dance commissions, and something like this might still make its way into the game, where Sulikana or Igdistis would come to you and say, okay, this month we have this guy from Moscow with very special requirements. So here's a knife, and here's a monkey. You need some winter influence and a doctor for afterwards. And you'd have to decide whether to take it or not and how to deal with the consequences or what effect they might have on your ascension, all this sort of stuff. More randomness, more variety, more content, more ick. And there just wasn't anything like enough time. I had to cut down the initial design quite aggressively because I realized it was already way too big to justify its cost. So well done, you've got good value, but I enjoyed writing it, so that's fine. And I had a similar problem with Romance. The initial Romance design, which I talked about on a stream a couple of months back now, was more elaborate than what went into the game. And I started implementing it, and I realized all the wrinkles that were coming out of that. And I realized some problems with the design. And I went into a bit of a funk and actually went down and sat in Lottie's office and said, I think I fucked this up. I'm not sure where to go from here. And she talked me through it and came up with a pretty key insight, which I'll come back to in a moment. But I think as a designer, design bloat is a thing, especially if you're the designer and also a business owner. And you can always find a justification putting more stuff in. It's worth thinking about what the scope of something is intended to be and cutting back, especially because the thing about Cultist is that I'll look at an individual system and I'll think that's really simple. And then I'll zoom out and I realize in the content of the 100,000 words or whatever it is that's in there now, all interacting with each other, it's actually part of a really complicated system. And the last thing I wanted to do is make it even more complicated, because the people I talk to all the time on the Discord tend to be hardcore veteran players who understand all the minutiae of the game. And I always have to remember the people who bought the game on Steam yesterday and are coming in and saying, I don't understand what the difference between erudition, lesson learned, and reason, and a reason skill are. Because why the hell should they? It's a complicated system. So I'm learning to grapple with my tendency to design bloat. Romances. So here's the thing. Originally, romances had much more instrumental effect on the game. It's a lot more about choosing individuals and interacting with them to get specific mechanical effects and having to deal with the specific mechanical consequences. So if you had a romance with somebody who had the tempestuous archetype, then you'd chosen a high-risk way of getting contentment that might sometimes give you extra rewards. And that, you know, fed into writing and fed into personality, but I kept finding ways to make it strategically interesting. So one, that made the system really complicated for players to engage with and really expensive for me to build. And also I kept feeling like it was the wrong approach. It didn't really make sense. And what people liked about the romance was not that you could break down Neville or Leo or Rhaenyra or Saliba or Enid to a particular set of stats, but the writing and the art and the larger sort of fanon about it gave you the sense of a personality that you wanted to engage with. And the insight luckily came back when I said I'm losing my way in the thickets here, is that a lot of folk just wanted to be able to role play in a fairly minimal way, having a romance with a character they had an emotional attachment to, and having the game recognize, respect, and respond to that. So the key thing wasn't that Neville should do something that was distinct mechanically in every important way from every other follower in the game. That pauses me thinking somebody's probably typing right now, Neville should be mechanically distinct, it should cause you to win the game. But it wasn't that an individual follower should be very mechanically distinct. Well, obviously there are mechanical differences. It's that there should be some content in there that gave you the sense that you are having a thing with Saliba or Violet or Dorothy, rather than with a lustful follower or a wintry follower or a I always get Rose and Dorothy confused. Or a tempestuous follower, whatever. So I lent into that. I actually changed the framework a bit, so it made it easier to do variant writing in different contexts. And people seem to have liked the result. And I haven't heard anybody saying they felt the romance needed more mechanical aspects to it. That piece of feedback has been notable by its absence. I'm going to exclusively reveal at this point who wrote which content. So Cultist Simulator is no longer 100% Alexis Kennedy's writing. Lottie wrote some of the romance content. And if you are wondering which content Lottie wrote, if you tried to guess already, Lottie wrote all of the endings. I didn't write any of them. I wrote all the content leading up to all the endings, and then Lottie looked at the existing briefs of the characters and the existing fiction and wrote. And her direction was, I said, please don't make these saccharine, but don't make them too mean. Even like Saliba, because I don't want people to feel bilked that they choose to stay behind with their lover rather than ascend. And the ending is, yeah, actually have a shit marriage, and you wish that you'd gone on to be immortal and eat people. And I think she did a fucking great job. And if I didn't think she'd done a fucking great job, I wouldn't have let it into the game, because I'm very particular about that stuff. Anyway, the secret is out. Very quickly, Rivals. One bit of feedback I did have got consistently is that Rivals are quite easy to avoid, and that's intentional. I'm not sure how the metagame will pan out with balance with Rivals in the long term, especially once I add a couple more changes, one of which I'm about to talk in a bit. And again, not every change needs to be about tuning the difficulty of the game. A lot of it is about adding content to the game people will experience, the exploration rather than the survival aspect. So I wanted Rivals to be something that cropped up in some games and were fictionally interesting and gave it a bit of a different experience and some different challenge. So now you basically only get Rivals by jilting your lovers. It can happen in other ways. It can happen if you drive a detective mad. Very, very occasionally, people will develop enough resentment on their own to leave your cult, but it tends to be fairly easy to avoid. I may change that later, but I want to see how things shake out first. But I think generally, the game would benefit more from more variety in different playthroughs, something I hear again and again. So I think more playthroughs that, is conditioned by getting a rival towards the end, or getting in a battle with the long when I implement that, or having a complicated network of romancers. It gives the game a different cue each time. So I think there'll be more features that don't necessarily show up in every playthrough. Advanced and major victories, because I know that's the thing that a lot of people are interested in. This was design bloat as well. The reason it didn't go into this update when I'd intended to put the first advanced victory in this is they kept getting more complicated the more I thought about them. And also, once they start getting more complicated, it made sense to implement two at the same time. So it's probably going to be Tainted Blood and I think I said Shapes at the same time. And the way it's likely to work is this. If you win with a standard ascension victory, you will always get access to the Apostle Legacy. If you win with any other kind of victory or die in any other way, you might get access to the Apostle Legacy. It's in the deck of possible legacies. The Apostle Legacy starts you with the remnants of your previous cult, an advanced start, basically, a bunch of lore and power and some starting followers, but also gives you a rival to begin with. So it's a bit of a new game plus effect is immediately a bit harder. And that's your basic advanced game. And the basic advanced victory will be the implementation of the stub higher level ritual that you have, some of you have seen hanging around in the game code forever. So it's then harder to assemble the power you need for a Lantern Forge or Grail ascension. There probably won't be advanced dancer ascensions because fuck that shit. The complications terrify me. And then you're doing something like using your preferred follower to create a dreadful fusion of flesh and spirit, which will contain your essence for the next phase, or creating a great machine, which will cause something of a cataclysm, but is necessary for the next phase. And then if you manage to do that advanced victory, then we're talking the next level up where you're trying to become a name and you're trying to do something even grander in the specific context of having just won that victory, something that follows on from the dreadful tainted blood fusion of flesh and spirit, or the great machine. Two things. First of all, this is not confirmed. I may change it again. 8 victory levels, from tremendous to grand to epic to legendary to stonking, and you have to play the game for 400 years. I don't know, it could be even more bonkers, but it's probably going to be at 3 levels. And finally, I am not saying, I'm not confirming a part of the game where you play as a name. I'm saying we're probably going to get a standard, advanced, major victories, the major victories becoming a name, and at some point you may have a fourth level beyond that, but I'm not confirming it right now because I don't want to be undone by my own ambition again. So that's the shape of it. This, by the way, is just me thinking about fitting together all the features for all the upcoming builds in one place. A lot of it, the design changes. I want to try to lay down foundations for things in Christopher that will make sense in Franklin in the next build after that. The post-it notes are things that we've specifically promised and said we'll do. So those don't get erased. They just move around and get different things drawn around them. Pink and blue means they're probably going to be paid DLC, but not necessarily. Yellow means it's probably going to be free advancement, but not necessarily. Key thing there, the research stuff is a lot of the focus of my design at the moment. I want to make research a bit more interesting because it's nobody's favorite part of the game. There needs to be a bit of business around upgrading lore, but what we've got at the moment isn't great. And that's like to plug into the expeditions and into the patrons and into the advanced HQs. Okay, that's me. Hit me with questions, please, my darling. Yes.
Are there any plans to add in something that can be a romance stream?
Yes.
Where people can express romantic interest on a
Yeah, it's a good question. That was part of the design. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Repeat the question. Are there any plans to make people express romantic interest on their own? It's a good question. And at the moment, no. I took it out of the design, and here's why. There's an issue with players, PCs in games generally expressing interest in NPCs and not vice versa. It always feels like you're chasing them, not them chasing you. And if you've got 20 NPCs, none of whom will express an interest in you on their own, but all of whom are available to you to express interest in, that feels a bit weird, especially when they're all your followers, because obviously a lot of cults do end up serving the purpose of being a sort of blood bank for sexually voracious leaders. But I'm not interested in simulating that kind of cult. That's why polyamory is limited in Cultist. If you have two romantic interests, it's expressed as being romantic rather than purely sexual. People get jealous of each other because I didn't want the sense you had a harem. So to take the curse off that a bit and make it less about you saying, yes, I choose you, Neville, I choose you, Rhaenyra. I initially liked the idea that you'd have to wait for an NPC to come to you. It's very unsatisfying because basically people say, when do I get to date Neville? Or when do I get to date Rhaenyra? Or when do I get to date Celebra? Except nobody ever says that. And I can see it being very unsatisfying if you had to wait to see if somebody showed up in a given playthrough, or if you had to like roll a dice and 30% of the time they'd be interested and the rest of the time they wouldn't. So I was trying to build the bridge between you can have anyone you like and it's not too weird and predatory. What I came to was you can only date people who you share a driving passion with. So that provides some sort of fictive bridge where a quarter of the followers may be interested in you depending on what you've chosen as your driving passion because it matches theirs. So it feels more organic, even though it's actually a really simple choice. I mean, it's also exploitable. You can, if you're a monster, keep dreaming on your initial desire to change it and date every single one of the followers between times, so they all end up rivals and serves you right in that case. But that was the intention, and we also felt that if you as I originally intended, you heal somebody and they fall in love with you, which is very mechanically difficult to make that work without being a huge pain in the arse. Either they'd be potentially interested in you and it would happen randomly, so we didn't get people getting a chance to date the people they wanted unless they waited around for it and kept wounding somebody to heal them, to get them interested in romance, or give them gifts to interest them in romance, which again is a bit too Tamagotchi for my taste. And the idea that you'd keep on healing people and they'd keep on falling in love with you, it was varied between being frivolous, dark, and annoying. So I took it out. It's probably not coming back, but never say never. Possible follow-up question. I do absolutely intend to add romance for detectives in.
Okay, then I have the last question.
Mhm.
Our mark now. Are you planning any changes for the Mansus exploration?
No. I'm not. Are there any? Am I planning any changes to the Mansus exploration? No, but I'm not reading them out either. So the Mansus serves 3 purposes in game. And I did a lot of work around what it was going to be. I wanted the Mansus in the game in some format, and narratively, it's another way to introduce lore into the game, and mechanically, it's primarily a place to farm influencers. It's also a gate on certain parts of Ascension, of course, as well. It's got some other, but those are the 2 big things, narratively and mechanically. And also thematically, I've told this story before. Ian Livingstone, the guy who founded IDOS and Games Workshop, Lottie met on a train one time, and we had lunch with him and showed him in the game. And he said, you should put a map in the game. Everyone likes maps, and it shows you where you need to go in the game. And at that point, we didn't have much budget left for the rest of the game. So, that's fucking right, isn't he? We paid Catherine Unger to do that big, lovely Mansus map, and we paid Martin to do some work around doing the Mansus reveal. And that then has a sort of a third, larger thematic effect. It gives you that moment of, holy fuck, there's more in here. And it shows you where you need to go. It says there's higher levels to get to. You're stumbling around in the dark, but actually maybe there's a route up here. So I don't want to bolt things on just to make it more interesting. There are lots and lots and lots of things you could do with the Mansus. You'd have mini choose your own adventures in there. You could have things following you home. You could have events where you get lost in the Mansus. You could have recipes which can only occur in the Mansus. I thought of all of these things and I ruled them out because they didn't do one of the main functions. And I've always been bad about being disciplined about design. It's back to the design blade again. So I think it's basically going to do what it does and nothing else. But I'm absolutely not ruling out other paradigm changing experiences that are like the Mansus. So I always like the idea that the table flipped and you're in a different city, for example. I'm not ruling those in either, but if we do something else Mansus-like, it will probably be around adding another layer to the game that does something different again, rather than expanding the experience as it is. I think I did. What did I forget to say at the end? Buy our game, please. You've already bought our game or you wouldn't be here. But thank you for buying our game, because it allows us to continue eating and making games, which are my 2 main purposes in life. No, we haven't. Is it still on sale? Jesus Christ, what are you made of? Okay, it's still on sale. The game's got 25% off if you haven't bought it, but then you haven't bought it, you wouldn't be here. DLC's free if you've got Perpetual Edition, and $3 otherwise. If any of you live in Bilbao, Lottie and I are both doing talks at the Fun and Serious Games Conference in December. If any of you live in San Francisco, I've submitted a talk to GDC. It's in 2nd phase submission, so that might happen. If I do, that will be about combining, trying to make a game that is both narratively experimental and commercially successful. And we're probably, if any of you live in Riga, we are probably at TBC doing a couple of talks in Riga in April as well. So thank you very much. I'm Alexis Kennedy, and I'm going to go to sleep now.